Tonight we wander into a city where the streets echo with sandals slapping against stone, where torchlight flickers across marble steps, and where shadows stretch in long, uneven arcs across the ground. You're in Athens, though not the noisy Athens of tourist buses and camera flashes, but the ancient one, dusty, fragrant with olive smoke, and loud with the endless chatter of voices in the agora. Philosophers gather not in sleek lecture halls, but in courtyards where the floor has been smoothed by thousands of steps. You see them moving slowly, deliberately, walking in circles, as if the ground itself is a chalkboard. Their cloaks drag the dust, their hands wave mid-sentence, and you can almost hear the scrape of sandals marking invisible rings into the earth. You probably won't survive this lifestyle, by the way. These men debated for hours under the Mediterranean sun with no iced lattes, no sunscreen, and definitely no ergonomic footwear. They chose the long robe and a sandal with the support of a modern flip-flop, perfect for generating blisters, not perfect for circulation. And yet somehow they lived long enough to keep arguing about the shape of the cosmos. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, post in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. I'm always fascinated to know who else is wandering through these stories at midnight or at dawn. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step closer, the courtyard of a gymnasium opening up before you. Lanterns hang from hooks, dripping wax down their sides, casting wide, trembling halos. The air is alive with murmurs, punctuated by bursts of laughter when someone makes a witty jab. You notice that the conversation seems to move with the feet, ideas rising and falling as the philosophers pace, never standing still long enough to grow stiff. It's less a lecture, more a dance, though the rhythm is uneven and the choreography is improvised. Historically, Athens thrived on conversation. Public speaking wasn't a specialised skill for rare occasions. It was woven into the fabric of daily life. Citizens argued politics in the assembly, oratory contests drew crowds, and philosophy wasn't read in silence but performed aloud, tested against others' ears. You find yourself drifting with the circle, swept into the slow whirlpool of bodies. The centre remains empty, symbolic perhaps, or merely practical, so everyone can face one another as they loop round and round. Historians still argue whether this circular formation was deliberate symbolism of cosmic order, or just the easiest way to keep everyone included without shouting across the courtyard. A fringe tidbit. Some accounts suggest these night walks doubled as an informal guard routine. With Athens always wary of unrest, a cluster of men walking predictably in circles gave the impression of order, as though philosophy itself policed the peace. It's not clear whether this was intentional or accidental, but the sight of cloaked men shuffling beneath lantern light might have comforted neighbours, unless of course they found the endless circles slightly creepy. The scent of crushed thyme drifts from a nearby garden, and as you inhale, you feel the pacing settle into your bones. The body relaxes into the rhythm, and the mind follows. You notice how questions rise with each step forward. What is justice? What is happiness? What does it mean to know anything at all? And just as quickly answers are tested, swatted down, replaced by another. The circle becomes a machine that generates thought, and you, caught in its orbit, start to realise why walking became the philosopher's chosen tool. One man coughs, adjusts his cloak and nearly collides with another. Laughter breaks the solemn rhythm, reminding you that this wasn't an austere ritual but also a social act, full of human flaws and humour. Maybe one of them just tripped on a loose stone. Maybe another lost his train of thought because someone yawned too loudly. Even in the heart of intellectual history, people were still just people, endlessly pacing, endlessly circling, endlessly searching. You keep drifting with the group, and before long you find yourself among the peripatetics. That word alone sounds fancy enough to be printed on an overpriced tote bag, but in truth, it comes from something incredibly simple. Walking. Aristotle, the great system builder of philosophy, earned his reputation not just for categorizing logic, biology, and metaphysics, but for pacing endlessly with his students in the Lyceum. They didn't sit cross-legged on cushions or recline dramatically on couches like a Netflix portrayal of Rome. They walked. Around columns, through courtyards, up and down shaded colonnades, they moved as one, following Aristotle's steady shuffle. The Greek verb peripatein literally means to walk about. That's how his school got its name. Imagine your entire intellectual movement branded forever because your teacher couldn't sit still. As you match their steps, you notice something almost hypnotic in the motion. Aristotle pauses mid-sentence, gestures with one hand, then resumes walking, as if his ideas are tied by a string to the rhythm of his sandals. He believed knowledge came not just from abstract reflection, but from observing the world, plants, animals, weather, behaviour. And walking placed him in contact with it all. Each circle wasn't only a path through space, but a survey of sounds, smells and sights. You can almost picture him halting the group because he spotted an oddly shaped leaf, launching into a digression that lasted 40 minutes. Historians still argue whether Aristotle deliberately turned walking into a teaching method, or if he was simply restless, unable to tolerate benches after a long meal. A quirky tidbit. Some later commentators whispered that Aristotle walked so much he wore grooves into the stone floors of the Lyceum. Whether that's literal or exaggerated, it gives you the image of deep, dusty tracks circling the courtyards, like ancient vinyl records scratched by centuries of restless scholars replaying arguments. Students likely complained, sandals don't have cushioning after all, but they followed him anyway, partly out of respect, partly because once the master kept moving you had no choice unless you wanted to look lazy. The night air feels heavy with olive smoke as you imagine being one of those students. You'd be clutching a wax tablet, trying to jot down half a thought while jogging to keep up. Maybe your stylus slips, and suddenly you've written goat instead of good. Now the great master is off explaining why all humans desire knowledge, and you're stuck wondering why goats suddenly entered the metaphysical discussion. And yet it's in these imperfect, slightly comedic details that philosophy became alive, not just ink on scrolls, but a living thing shaped by motion. This walking habit also helped Aristotle dodge the static formality of other schools. In Plato's Academy, students debated while strolling too, but Aristotle intensified the practice, transforming it into a rhythm of thought itself. Pacing, pausing, resuming, it mirrored argument, advance, test, retreat, refine. Like the pulse of conversation, it never fully stopped. You sense how the circular path was less about reaching a destination than about orbiting endlessly around truth, tugged by gravity toward questions that could never fully resolve. A small joke hangs in the air. You realize if anyone had invented fitness trackers back then, Aristotle would have obliterated his step count before noon. 10,000 steps? He'd laugh and probably ask you to define step before proving your Fitbit's premise faulty. But the truth remains, the peripatetic school turned walking into philosophy's heartbeat, and the echo of those sandals still vibrates across lecture halls today, where professors can't seem to keep still while explaining anything. You notice how your own mind begins to sharpen as you fall into rhythm with the group. There's something about the steady roll of heel to toe, the little shift of balance, the soft swish of fabric, brushing fabric, that keeps the brain humming at a different frequency. The philosophers seem to know this intuitively. Walking isn't just moving, it's thinking with your legs. Even modern researchers will tell you that gentle motion improves circulation. clears mental fog and sparks creativity. Back then they didn't have neuroscience, but they had experience. And experience taught them that pacing in circles did something strange. It made the difficult questions feel just a little more approachable. You can almost picture Aristotle, or maybe one of his students, halting mid-stride saying, "Aha! The syllogism works," while someone else nearly collides with him because they were still focused on debating whether virtue was habit or divine gift. The walking made thought slippery, easier to catch in motion than when trapped in stillness. Historians still argue whether the Greeks believed walking literally unlocked higher reasoning, or whether it was just a quirk of classroom routine. The truth is probably both. People do what feels effective, and then later they explain it with cosmic metaphors. A quirky tidbit hides in the margins of an ancient medical text. Some doctors advised pacing in circles after heavy meals to settle the humours and keep bile from rising. So in a way, philosophy and digestion marched side by side. Maybe that explains why debates about justice sometimes smelled faintly of garlic and lamb. And maybe it explains why certain students were particularly enthusiastic about these lessons. They just wanted to avoid stomach cramps. The sensation of walking becomes its own metaphor. Each step forward feels like an argument advanced, each turn in the circle like a counterpoint. You realise how the body itself mirrors dialectic. Instead of sitting rigidly like statues, these men embraced the fact that thought is fluid, restless, never perfectly still. And as you shuffle with them, you find your own mind wandering into strange places. Is truth really a fixed point? Or is it just something we orbit endlessly like a planet circling the sun? That's the sort of thought that drifts through the air here. Half practical, half cosmic, half a joke waiting to happen. Speaking of jokes, you can imagine a student whispering, "If walking makes us wise, then why is my uncle, who paces the fish market all day, still convinced the world is flat?" The laughter ripples through the group, and even Aristotle might smirk, before launching into an explanation of why observation plus reasoning beats superstition. And just like that, the rhythm resumes, sandals scuffing dust back into the air, and thought keeps circling. There is something comforting about it. No need for desks, chalkboards or projectors, just feet, dust and the night sky above, vast and memorious. The more they walked, the more their minds aligned with that infinity, as if the cosmos itself were pulling ideas down to earth one step at a time. You feel the ground warm beneath your sandals, the faint ache of muscles reminding you that walking, for all its elegance as a philosophical tool, was also practical excellence. In a city like Athens, crowded with narrow alleys, smoky taverns and busy markets, you couldn't exactly roll out a yoga mat. Instead, a few loops around the colonnade doubled as a wellness routine. Philosophers liked to pretend they were above the body, but the truth was simple. They needed their legs to carry their brains. And those brains, for all their brilliance, did not come with ergonomic office chairs or standing desks. You imagine the courtyards of the gymnasia, part school, part athletic complex, where men boxed, wrestled and ran while philosophers shuffled slowly nearby. The odd ducks in a sea of sweaty competitors. It wasn't rare for philosophy and athletics to overlap. Aristotle himself studied anatomy, and his students dissected animals in the same spaces where others lifted weights. To the Greeks, the mind and body weren't neatly separated. Walking in circles wasn't just symbolic, it was cardio too. Historians still argue whether this health benefit was intentional or a convenient side effect, but it's hard to ignore the way circles kept joints loose and blood flowing. A quirky tidbit surfaces from old medical lore. Hippocrates once recommended walking briskly in shaded places as a cure for melancholy. Picture a gloomy philosopher pacing under a grove of plane trees, muttering about the nature of being, while also, unbeknownst to him, treating his seasonal depression. That's ancient multitasking, therapy session and metaphysical exploration bundled into one. You glance at the men circling beside you, and you realise they might have been fitter than you'd expect. Sure, they didn't deadlift amphorae for Instagram clout, but all those hours pacing added up. Imagine Aristotle unintentionally building calves of steel. Imagine students dragging their feet at first, only to discover they'd walked 3 miles by the end of class. You can almost hear one groaning, "If wisdom doesn't come soon, at least I'll have thighs like a hoplite." The circles also gave the mind space to breathe. Instead of cramming inside dim rooms filled with smoke and chatter, these thinkers inhaled fresh air, heard birds roosting on the roof tiles, smelled figs ripening on nearby trees. Each sensory detail wove itself into their lectures. Philosophy was not just abstract, it was embodied, tethered to the rhythm of lungs, the thump of heartbeats, the cadence of sandals on stone. And as you walk with them now, your own body sways to that same pulse, a reminder that thought and flesh were never truly separate. And here's a small joke the philosophers themselves might have whispered: we pace so our ideas don't collapse under the weight of our bellies. You chuckle, and the circle keeps spinning, carrying wisdom one dusty step at a time. The circle tightens, and suddenly the symbolism begins to glow. To you it looks less like a class, and more like a miniature model of the heavens. The Greeks adored circles. They saw them everywhere, in the path of the sun across the sky, in the monthly loop of the moon, in the steady revolution of stars around the pole. To walk in circles was to echo the cosmos itself, to rehearse in miniature the harmony of the universe. Every footstep became a little reminder that human life mirrored celestial order. You glance up and the night sky of Athens is dazzling. No light pollution, no buzzing neon, just thousands of stars wheeling in arcs above your head. The philosophers below traced the same arcs with their bodies. It wasn't random, it was ritual, an imitation of fine geometry. Historians still argue whether the peripatetics consciously thought of their walks as cosmic mimicry, or whether later writers projected this neat symbolism onto them. But even if no one declared it, you can't deny the poetry of the parallel. A quirky tidbit flickers in from Pythagorean circles. Some of those mathematician mystics taught that walking in loops generated harmony in the soul, aligning the body with the music of the spheres. Imagine being told your feet could literally tune your spirit like a lyre string. That's not exactly gym advice you'd get today, but in its own way it makes sense. Repetition, rhythm, cadence, all building a meditative trance. And trance is exactly what you start to feel. The steady scuff of sandals on stone blurs into a soft background hum, like the turning of a wheel. Step after step, the philosophers talk of ethics, politics, logic, and metaphysics. But you're no longer only listening, you're orbiting as though caught in gravity, circling the invisible sun of truth. Jokes, of course, slipped into this cosmic solemnity. Imagine one student nudging another. If our circle represents the heavens, then why does your orbit always drift toward the food vendor? Another groans. If the circle reflects perfection, then why is mine shaped like a potato? Laughter breaks the trance, but only briefly. Soon the circle regains its dignity, and the philosophers keep stepping, convinced they're sketching eternity under their feet. As you drift with them, you realise how fragile the line is between practicality and metaphor. Maybe they walked because it helped them focus. Maybe they walked because they were restless. Or maybe, without saying it aloud, they believed each loop stitched them into the fabric of the cosmos, one dusty circle at a time. The circle drifts sideways, and now you find yourself under the long painted colonnades of the Stoa Poikile. Here the philosophers known as Stoics preferred to pace, their footsteps echoing off stone columns painted with murals of battles and myths. It's easy to imagine them walking slowly, hands clasped behind their backs, speaking in calm tones about fate, virtue, and the indifference of external things, even as their sandals squeaked against a marble slick with the morning dew. Zeno of Citium, the founder of Stoicism, didn't have his own fancy gymnasium like Aristotle, so he made the marketplace porch his classroom. The Stoa became their walking ground, and soon the nickname stuck. Stoikoi, those of the Stoa. As you shuffle along beside them, you realise how public their teaching was. Instead of secluded courtyards, they lectured within earshot of vendors hawking olives, fishmongers gutting their catch, and jugglers trying to earn a coin. Yet somehow, pacing back and forth beneath those columns gave them a rhythm, a stage without walls. Historians still argue whether Stoic pacing was more symbolic or just a practical solution. After all, standing still in a crowded porch means getting jostled by every passerby. Walking in lines or slow arcs gave their lessons order, and perhaps it was their way of embodying resilience. Life, like the Stoa, is noisy and chaotic, but you can carve a steady path through it, step by step. A quirky tidbit lurks in anecdotes about Chrysippus, one of the great Stoics. Supposedly he was so prone to pacing while thinking that students joked his sandals wore thin faster than his scrolls. Whether true or not, it paints a funny picture. A man so dedicated to philosophy that he accidentally became his own cobbler's best customer. You try to stay serious as one Stoic explains that emotions should be disciplined, that grief, anger, even joy must be kept in check. But then another student nearly collides with a column, muttering something about fate's indifference to stubbed toes, and the solemn lesson dissolves into muffled laughter. The pacing resumes, slow and steady, as if nothing had happened, because of course a Stoic would say nothing truly had. Here, walking wasn't just exercise or focus, it was metaphor in motion. Each back and forth stroll beneath the painted walls mirrored life's narrow path between chaos and calm. Each circle, each line, each measured step whispered, "Stay steady, even when the marketplace roars." And you, drifting along with them, begin to feel that steadiness seep into your own bones. The circle widens again, and this time you notice something practical. Walking in circles made the philosopher's voice easier to hear. Without microphones or even a handy amphitheatre, teachers had to improvise. If they stood still, the students in the back strained to catch each word, the wind carrying syllables away toward the olive groves. But by circling slowly, the teacher's voice rotated through the group, drifting past each listener in turn like a lighthouse beam sweeping over ships at sea. You shuffle beside one student clutching a wax tablet, and you notice how his stylus scratches more confidently when the teacher's mouth turns his way. Then, as the circle shifts, someone else gets the clarity. It wasn't high technology, but it worked. Historians still argue whether the circle was designed for this acoustic convenience or whether it simply became useful by accident. Either way, the steady shuffle created a mobile classroom, sound carried evenly, and no one could hide in the back pretending to pay attention while doodling centaurs. A quirky tidbit appears in later Roman sources. Some teachers even required students to rotate positions within the circle, so the quiet ones were forced closer to the front. Imagine being a shy Athenian teenager, thinking you'd found a safe spot behind a tall friend, only to be spun suddenly into Aristotle's line of fire. That must have been the ancient equivalent of being cold-called in class, except now you had to keep walking while trying not to faint. And of course, the whole arrangement wasn't free from comedy. You can imagine a student whispering, "If the teacher keeps spinning like this, I'll end up dizzy enough to agree with anything." Another mutters, "The circle ensures fairness. Everyone gets equally blistered feet." A ripple of laughter breaks across the group, sandals stumbling, but the rhythm recovers, like a song that skips a beat before continuing. The marketplace noise hums beyond the walls, merchants shouting, animals bleating, hammers striking bronze. Inside the circle, though, it feels contained. Voices directed inward, minds orbiting around the centre of shared thought. The circle isn't just movement, it's a barrier, a buffer, a way of carving space in the chaos, and you realise how clever the philosophers were. By walking together, they created not just a method, but a world of their own, where ideas could survive the din of Athens. As the night deepens, you notice a subtle choreography unfolding among the students. They don't just trail behind their master like children following a schoolteacher, they orbit him. The philosopher at the centre becomes a kind of sun radiating vague words, while the disciples revolve around in slow arcs, each one taking turns closer or farther, depending on boldness or shyness. The effect is less like a lecture and more like astronomy in motion. Imagine standing in Aristotle's circle, with the master himself walking at the hub, and students rotating like Mercury, Mars or Jupiter, depending on who dared to ask the bigger questions. Sometimes the most eager students crowded close only to be gently nudged outward again by others who needed their turn. It was a silent negotiation of space, bodies weaving like a constellation come to life. Historians still argue whether this orbital teaching was structured intentionally, or whether the metaphor is just too tempting for later scholars to resist. Still, you can't help but see the poetry of it. A quirky tidbit hides in anecdotes about the young Theophrastus, Aristotle's successor. His nickname meant divine speech, because apparently his words were so elegant that listeners felt enchanted. Students said they naturally drew near to him as he spoke, clustering tightly as if caught in a gravitational pull. In other words, the circle sometimes collapsed into a spiral, with everyone pressing closer, desperate not to miss a syllable. The poor note-takers in the back must have cursed under their breath, squinting through the crowd. Of course, the arrangement sparked its share of comedy. You can almost hear a student joking, "If he's the sun, then I call being Venus. At least I get warmth." Another grumbles, "Why am I always Saturn? My orbit is freezing." The laughter blends with the shuffle of sandals, and soon the circle steadies again, like planets resuming their courses after a momentary wobble. The rhythm becomes hypnotic. Master in the middle, disciples around, questions rising and falling like tides. No desks, no chalk, no slides, just bodies moving in harmony. Teaching itself embodied as a solar system on Earth. And as you drift among them, you feel that same gravity tug at you, pulling you into the orbit of an idea, that learning was never meant to be static, but something alive, moving, circling endlessly around the light of knowledge. The circle drifts further from the centre of Athens, and you notice why. Distractions. Imagine trying to discuss the immortality of the soul while a fishmonger waves an octopus in your fourgon, or while children shriek and chase each other through the agora. Staying still in one spot left you exposed to interruption, hecklers, and the occasional donkey, braying too loudly for anyone to hear the finer points of metaphysics. By pacing in circles, the philosophers carved a boundary between themselves and the chaos, moving but not wandering, enclosed but not trapped. The motion itself created a mental shield. You sense it. The moment the circle begins, the noise of the market dulls. The mind focuses inward, hearing mostly the voices of your fellow walkers, the steady rhythm of sandals grinding dust. Historians still argue whether this deliberate separation was practical classroom management or a conscious rejection of distraction. But either way, the circle acted like invisible walls. It turned open courtyards into makeshift sanctuaries, humming with words instead of noise. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some sources suggest that Socrates, though not a peripatetic in the formal sense, was notorious for zoning out so deeply that he once stood frozen into a place for hours, ignoring the world around him. Later philosophers, perhaps worried about looking ridiculous, learned that pacing in circles avoided such embarrassing statuesque episodes. At least when you moved, no one thought you'd fallen asleep with your eyes open. And comedy was never far away. Picture a student sighing, "We circle to escape the distractions of the marketplace. Yet the distraction is that my stomach keeps reminding me about the baker's stall." Another chuckles. "The circle isn't for philosophy, it's to keep us from running off to the tavern." A ripple of laughter breaks through, sandals scuffing, the rhythm briefly broken before returning to its steady cadence. As you follow the circle, you feel it too. The world beyond fades. The chatter of merchants, the smell of grilled meat, the clatter of carts, all dissolve into background static. What remains is the circle itself. Voices flowing, thoughts circling, questions spiralling towards something larger. For a moment you realize that philosophy didn't just happen in words. It happened in the space they carved from chaos. A fragile sanctuary built from footsteps. The circle continues and you start to notice that the steps themselves carry a rhythm. Soft scuff, pause, shuffle, repeat. It isn't just random motion. It feels almost like a drumbeat under the words. A ritual cadence that wraps the conversation in quiet ceremony. Each philosopher adjusts unconsciously to the pace, their voices rising and falling in sync with footsteps. It's as if the body is metronome, keeping thought from wandering too far off key. To the Greeks, rhythm wasn't just pleasant, it was powerful. Poetry, music, dance, and philosophy blurred together in ways modern minds sometimes separate too neatly. By repeating the same loop step after step, the philosophers entered something like a meditative trance. You can feel it yourself. After a dozen laps, your breath steadies, your shoulders relax, your thoughts stop bouncing like startled birds. The circle teaches your body patience, and your body teaches your mind. Historians still argue whether philosophers saw this as intentional ritual or simply stumbled upon its calming effect by habit. A quirky tidbit. Some late antique writers claim that Pythagoreans swore oaths while pacing in circles, chanting formulas in time with their steps. The repetition gave the words a strange force, embedding them in memory and rhythm at once. Imagine the peripatetics unconsciously inheriting that same sense of ritual, though instead of vows to mystical numbers, they murmured about ethics, logic, and metaphysics. And of course, with rhythm comes the occasional comic misstep. You can almost hear a sandal slap too hard, making everyone snicker. Or a student accidentally seeding up until he breaks ahead of the group, only to shuffle awkwardly back into place. Someone jokes, "The gods punish me for rushing wisdom," and the circle dissolves into chuckles before resuming its solemn pace. As you fall into stare again, you realize this rhythm isn't just physical, it mirrors the dialectic itself. Question, answer, rebuttal, counterpoint, step, turn, repeat. The circle is argument embodied, and as the courtyard fills with the low hum of voices and the soft scrape of sandals, you feel the ritual rhythm seep into you too, coaxing your thoughts into their own quiet orbit. The circle carries on, but even the most solemn rhythms can't escape a little ridicule. You begin to realize that not everyone in Athens thought walking philosophers were noble. Some playwrights and comic poets poked fun at them for pacing like lost sheep, looping endlessly as if unable to find the door. The joke practically wrote itself. They wander in circles because their arguments do too. You hear the echo of Aristophanes, the sharp-tongued satirist who once lampooned Socrates by suspending him in a basket in the clouds. While that particular jab wasn't about walking, you can imagine how easily he might have skewered the peripatetics. philosophers circling until dizzy, declaring the universe itself to be spinning. Historians still argue whether the comedians of Athens exaggerated these habits or whether the pacing was so obvious it couldn't be ignored. Either way, you realise the public found amusement in men shuffling round and round while claiming to unravel the mysteries of existence. A quirky tidbit from Roman humour adds spice. Some later wits quipped that Greek philosophers wore out sandals faster than they wrote scrolls. To a society that admired brevity, the image of men pacing for hours while producing endless pages of text seemed ripe for mockery. Imagine a Roman senator rolling his eyes. They speak in circles because they walk in circles. And within the circle itself, the students weren't immune to irony. You can almost hear one whisper to another, "If we walk long enough, perhaps we'll discover Atlantis, or at least a shoe shop." Another groans dramatically, "I've discovered the eternal truth. Blisters exist." The group chuckles, sandals scrape louder, and Aristotle sighs before carrying on as though nothing happened. The laughter doesn't break the spell, though. In fact, it keeps the circle human. Philosophy may have aimed at the eternal, but the people doing it still had sore feet, dry throats, and a sense of humour. And somehow knowing they could laugh at themselves made the whole thing easier to believe in. They weren't marble busts. They were living, breathing, joking men, pacing themselves into wisdom. The circle turns slower now, and you begin to sense something more than just exercise or classroom routine. There's an echo of ritual in the way the bodies move, a faint shimmer of something sacred beneath the dust. Greece wasn't only the land of philosophers, it was also the land of mystery cults, secret initiations, and symbolic dances. Walking in circles may have borrowed a rhythm not just from thought, but from worship. In Eleusis, initiates of Demeter's mysteries traced steps in torchlight, circling before descending into secret chambers. In Delphi, pilgrims sometimes processed around the temple before consulting the oracle. Circles meant eternity, cycles, the endless return of seasons. And now here you are, circling with philosophers, feeling that same undercurrent of sacred repetition. Historians still argue whether Aristotle's habits were influenced by ritual or whether later interpreters simply wove philosophy and religion together. But the resemblance is hard to miss. A quirky tidbit surfaces from Pythagorean tradition again. Some of those number worshippers forbade walking in straight lines during certain ceremonies, claiming it broke harmony. Imagine the Peripatetics adopting that rule, grumbling that truth itself might shatter if anyone dared take a shortcut across the circle. Whether serious or tongue-in-cheek, such overlaps remind you how blurred the lines were between reason and right. The students themselves likely noticed. You can imagine one whispering nervously, "Are we debating ethics or rehearsing for a sacrifice?" Another, braver, jokes, "If wisdom demands another 50 laps, then at least the gods could provide snacks." The laughter ripples, but beneath it lingers a hush, the sense that each step links them to something bigger than themselves. As you pace, the torches sputtering low, the circle feels less like a classroom and more like a cosmic ritual disguised as education. Each loop promises return, each turn erases the chaos outside, and for a brief moment you're part of something timeless, walking not just toward knowledge, but within a sacred geometry older than memory itself. The circle picks up pace, and soon the air hums with rivalry. Philosophy, after all, was never a polite tea party. It was a contact sport, minus the bruises, unless you count sandal blisters. You can almost hear the arguments clash like sparring swords. One philosopher insists that virtue is knowledge, another retorts that virtue is habit, and both keep pacing, circling each other like wrestlers in a ring. Debates often lasted for hours, carried on through dozens of laps, each man sharpening his logic while wearing down his souls. Imagine two rivals, robes swishing, sandals slapping dust, neither willing to yield the circle. Students jog between them, trying to catch every barb and counterpoint. Historians still argue whether these debates were strictly orderly or more like verbal melees where everyone chimed in, but anecdotes suggest they could grow heated. The circle became an arena, each turn around, each pause a breath before striking again with words. A quirky tidbit lingers in accounts of Carneades, a later philosopher famous for arguing one side of a question one day and the opposite the next. He was known to pace furiously during debates, leaving listeners dizzy. You can almost imagine students joking that he wasn't indecisive at all. He was just walking in both directions at once. And of course, humour bled through the seriousness. Picture a student gasping for air as the masters duel in a relentless dialectic, whispering to his neighbour, "I don't care who wins, my legs surrendered 10 laps ago." Another adds, "If truth depends on endurance, then my blisters prove nothing is real." The chuckles break tension, but the arguments march on just as relentless as the footsteps carrying them. The debates might not have solved every question, but the ritual of walking ensured that ideas weren't left to rot on parchment. They were tested, spun, chased, and hurled across the circle until the sun dipped low. And you, caught between two fiery voices, realize how fitting it is that truth was pursued not by sitting still, but by moving endlessly in pursuit of it. The circle slows, and your attention drifts downward, to the ground itself, to the blisters forming on heels, to the sandals fraying at their straps. For all the cosmic metaphors and lofty debates, there was the gritty reality of feet meeting stone day after day. Imagine dusty toes, cracked leather, and the occasional pebble lodged right where it hurt most. Philosophy may have been eternal, but shoes were not. The Greeks didn't have cushioned sneakers or orthopedic insoles. They had sandals, thin soles of leather tied with straps. Perfect for ventilation, not so perfect for pacing 100 laps around a colonnade. Students likely groaned when they felt the familiar sting of a rubbed raw heel. Historians still argue whether philosophers truly walked for hours non-stop or whether that image is exaggerated, but enough anecdotes survive to suggest that sore feet were practically part of the curriculum. A quirky tidbit drifts from later Roman writers. One claimed that a philosopher complained so much about blisters that his rivals mocked him by saying, "Wisdom had worn through his shoes." Whether apocryphal or not, you can see how it stuck, sandal blisters as the price of enlightenment. Another report says that shopkeepers near the Lyceum loved philosophers because they bought sandals so often they practically funded the cobbler's retirement. Of course, students joked about it. You can almost hear one limping along, muttering, "The path to virtue is paved with corns." Another adds, "If Aristotle insists on more walking, he'd better invent a philosophy of foot balm, though." The group laughs even as they keep trudging in circles, dust puffing with each step, and yet the discomfort only deepened the ritual. The body's protests reminded them that wisdom required endurance, that truth wasn't handed over while reclining on a couch. You had to sweat for it, limp for it, wear out your sandals for it. And somehow the sting of blisters became part of the rhythm too. A reminder that philosophy wasn't just mind in the clouds, but flesh grinding against stone. The circle carries you beyond Athens, drifting east across the sea. By the time you catch your breath, you're in Alexandria, that glittering jewel of learning where the echoes of Aristotle's pacing still rang in marble halls. The habit of walking in circles did not stay locked in one courtyard. It spread like olive oil poured from a jar, seeping into other schools and other cities. Wherever Greek culture went, so too did the shuffling sandals of philosophers. In Alexandria, scholars gathered in the great library and the museum, where scrolls were stacked higher than most people's patience. Yet even there, learning wasn't confined to chairs and benches. Teachers paced, students followed, loops formed, and the circle stretched its orbit into new lands. You imagine scholars walking along the shaded arcades, arguing about geometry, astronomy, medicine, each step tracing Aristotle's ghost. Historians still argue whether the Alexandrian scholars consciously imitated the Lyceum, or simply rediscovered for themselves that pacing made thinking easier. Either way, the tradition persisted like a melody hummed across generations. A quirky tidbit surfaces from later commentary. Some teachers in Alexandria supposedly arranged their students in double circles, an inner ring for the keenest and an outer ring for the stragglers. Picture it, 2 planetary systems orbiting simultaneously, like a classroom solar system with graduate students hogging Mercury, while beginners were banished to Saturn. It must have looked like choreography, a dance of dusty robes under the bright Egyptian sun. And naturally, humour followed the habit. Imagine one student grumbling, "We've walked so many circles, we'll soon wear a trench all the way to Ethiopia." Another complains, "The library has 1,000 scrolls, but none teach how to soothe sore calves." The laughter rises, sandals stumble, and then the rhythm resumes, steady as the Nile's current. By now you sense it clearly. Walking in circles wasn't just a quirk of Athens, it became the default classroom for centuries, a portable stay carried in the soles of philosophers' feet. From Athens to Alexandria, from small courtyards to the world's largest library, wisdom kept moving in circles, each step binding new lands into the orbit of thought. The circle rolls forward in time, and suddenly you're in Rome. Here, philosophers were both admired and mocked, their habits transplanted from Greece into a culture that loved grandeur, but also loved teasing anything that looked eccentric. Roman elites often imported Greek tutors for their children, and with them came the circular pacing. Soon the courtyards of villas echoed with the same sandal scuff rhythm that once filled Athens. But Romans, ever practical, couldn't resist poking fun. "Look," one might sneer, "they walk in circles so their arguments don't escape." Another quipped, "The Greeks pace because if they stood still, people would realise how little they know." The humour wasn't subtle, but you can hear the chuckles echoing through the Senate halls. Historians still argue whether Roman ridicule was affectionate banter or genuine irritation at philosophers invading their streets. A quirky tidbit appears in the writings of Seneca, himself a Stoic philosopher. He confessed to pacing restlessly while composing his letters, as though the body couldn't help but mimic the turbulence of thought. Yet others grumbled that these so-called wise men clogged public spaces, wandering endlessly while muttering to themselves. Imagine being a harried Roman merchant late for market, only to find a circle of allow me in the portico, and still admiration lingered. Cicero praised the intellectual traditions imported from Greece, even as he teased their quirks. Wealthy patrons built gardens and covered walkways not just for leisure but for philosophical pacing, as if adopting the habit gave them instant gravitas. You can almost picture a senator practicing his oration while looping around a marble fountain, hoping the rhythm of his steps would steady the rhythm of his words. Of course, comedy remained close at hand. One student, exhausted after hours of Roman sun, might groan, "If we walk any more circles, we'll outpace the chariots." Another quips, "The only philosophy I've mastered is the art of blisters." The laughter rings out, but the circle continues, unbroken, as if wisdom itself insisted on being chased in loops, whether in dusty Athens or under Rome's marble arches. The circle doesn't end with pagans. You blink, and centuries slide past. By candlelight and under cloistered arches, monks now trace the same looping paths. What began in Athens and spread through Rome quietly slipped into monasteries where early Christian scholars copied scrolls, debated theology, and, yes, paced in circles. Their sandals weren't Greek but rough leather. Their robes weren't philosophers' cloaks but wool habits. Yet the motion was familiar. Picture a Benedictine monk walking the covered cloister, murmuring psalms under his breath, then pausing to argue over Augustine's teachings. It wasn't so different from Aristotle's students trailing behind their master. The rhythm of circling steps suited prayer as much as philosophy, each loop a cycle of devotion, each turn a meditation on eternity. Historians still argue whether this was direct inheritance from Greek practice or simply a natural rhythm rediscovered, but the lineage feels too perfect to dismiss. A quirky tidbit drifts from medieval accounts. Some monasteries had circular paths built into their gardens, not for beauty alone, but to encourage walking prayer. You could imagine a monk looping again and again, his beads clicking softly, until his footsteps wore grooves into the stone just like the philosophers of old. Even in silence the circle spoke, and of course monks found their own humour in the habit. Imagine one novice groaning after too many laps. "If holiness requires another circuit, I pray for shorter cloisters." Another mutters, "If circles bring us closer to God, then I must be a saint by now." The laughter is muffled, respectful, but still present, proof that even in solemn cloisters, humour orbited devotion. As you follow their circle, the candlelight flickering against the cloister walls, you realise that the practice never truly belonged to one age. It had become a language of movement, passed from Aristotle's colonnades to monks' gardens, from debate to devotion. The circle endured, timeless, whispering its quiet rhythm across the centuries. The circle slows again, and now you find yourself not among philosophers or monks, but among scholars hunched over manuscripts. They're scratching notes in candlelight, debating across centuries. The question on their lips is the same one you've been circling all along. Why did Greek philosophers walk in circles? Some argue for practicality, walking kept the blood moving, the brain sharp, the voice audible. Others insist it was symbolic, an imitation of cosmic order or ritual geometry, and some shrug, saying perhaps Aristotle just hated chairs. Historians still argue whether the habit carried deep meaning, or whether later interpreters dressed up a simple quirk in grand robes of metaphor. A quirky tidbit comes from modern science. Psychologists have studied walking and discovered it boosts creativity and memory. Ironically, 21st century lab coats confirm what 4th century sandals already knew. But this raises more debates. Did the philosophers know why it worked, or did they simply stumble upon it? Did they pace with cosmic intent, or just because sitting in the dust was uncomfortable? And still the jokes linger. You imagine a weary student sassing across the centuries. "We walk in circles because wisdom itself has no exit." Another chimes in. "Our feet prove what our minds suspect. We're all going nowhere fast." Even in scholarly journals you catch a faint echo of that humour, buried between footnotes and hypotheses. The truth is, there may never be a single answer. Walking in circles was many things at once. Exercise, ritual, pedagogy, metaphor, comedy. It was philosophy embodied, the mind and body spinning together in restless pursuit of the eternal. And so the debate continues, looping like the steps themselves, with each new historian adding another lap to the circle. You blink, and the circle spins into the present day. Now it isn't togas or cloaks you see, but tweed jackets, chalk-dusted shirts, and professors with a permanent furrow between their brows. The lecture hall may have fluorescent lights instead of torches, but the rhythm hasn't changed. Teachers still pace. You watch one march left to right at the front of a classroom, pausing only to jab at the board with a piece of chalk before resuming the loop. The students follow him with their eyes like spectators at a slow-motion tennis match. It's almost comical how unchanged the habit is. Historians still argue whether modern professors are conscious heirs of Aristotle, or whether pacing is simply the natural instinct of anyone with too much caffeine and too many ideas. But the resemblance is uncanny. Lectures are circles, thoughts orbit chalkboards, and students still scribble furiously to keep up. A quirky tidbit from campus folklore. Some students swear they can predict exam difficulty by how many steps their professor takes per lecture. More pacing, they say, equals harder questions. Imagine Aristotle hearing this, chuckling at the thought that his legacy would someday be measured in step counts instead of syllogisms. And the humour is alive, too. One student whispers, "If he walks any farther, we'll have to install a treadmill." Another mutters, "The longer he paces, the less time he has for surprise quizzes. Keep walking, Professor, keep walking." The laughter is hushed, but it ripples through the room just as it did in Athens. As you watch, you realise the circle is never broken. From dusty courtyards to lecture halls, from sandals to loafers, wisdom keeps moving, restless, rhythmic, unwilling to stand still. And maybe that's the secret. Philosophy doesn't happen at a desk. It happens in motion, with footsteps keeping time to thought. The circle has carried you across centuries, from torchlit courtyards to lecture halls, and now it closes. The philosopher's sandals have worn thin, the monk's cloisters have quieted, and the professor's chalkboards stand dusty, but the rhythm remains, faint but unbroken. You feel it under your own feet, that endless loop of thought, step after step, orbit after orbit. What began as a simple habit, walking in circles, turned into a metaphor for the entire philosophical project. Knowledge was never a straight road with a neat finish line. It was a circle, looping back on itself, revisiting old questions, rephrasing old answers, circling closer, but never quite reaching the perfect centre. Historians still argue whether the circle was meant to symbolise the cosmos, or eternity, or just practical pedagogy, but in the end it doesn't matter. The truth is in the motion, not the destination. A quirky tidbit survives in sayings passed down from teacher to student. Philosophy is the art of taking long walks with short conclusions. It's half a joke, half a confession, and somehow it feels exactly right. The circle has faded, but its imprint remains. Professors still pace, students still orbit, and you, listening in the dark, have walked with them across time. You've heard sandals scrape, you've smelled olive smoke, you've laughed at the blisters, and you felt the steady hum of footsteps turning thought into rhythm. And now, as the circle closes, you realise it never truly ends. The philosophers are still walking, somewhere in memory, somewhere in imagination, somewhere in the steady pulse of question that return again and again. The circle is philosophy's DNA, restless, repetitive, eternal. So now let the rhythm of those footsteps soften into silence. Imagine the circle fading into dusk, the lanterns guttering low, the dust settling quietly back onto stone. The philosophers are still moving, but their voices blur into a distant murmur, gentle and indistinct, like waves rolling far away on a shore. You no longer need to follow every step, every word. You can simply let them drift by, as steady and harmless as the breeze. Your breath slows, matching the pace of the imagined circle. Inhale gently, exhale slowly. Feel the weight of your body sink deeper into comfort, like stone settling into earth. The tension in your shoulders eases. The corners of your mind begin to round out, and the sharp edges of thought soften. There's no need to chase answers now. They'll still be there tomorrow, waiting, circling, patient as ever. Instead, you let yourself rest in the quiet truth the philosophers always circled around but never quite caught, that life itself moves in rhythms, days and nights, seasons, heartbeats, footsteps. And just as they trusted those rhythms to carry their thoughts, you can trust this moment to carry you into rest. Picture the last torch going out, leaving only the glow of the stars above. The courtyard is still warm from the day, but the air is cool and calm. The circle has dissolved into silence, yet the peace remains. You are no longer walking, no longer listening, no longer questioning. You are simply here, safe, steady, cradled by the rhythm of the night. Let yourself drift with it now, away from dust and sandals, away from questions and debates, until sleep gathers you into its own quiet circle, closing gently, endlessly, peacefully.